Did you know that the ultranationalist Croatians, known as the Ustasha, committed such heinous crimes that it left the Germans present there bewildered? But why was that? Since the Wehrmacht itself also committed acts of terror and mass murder in occupied Yugoslavia. In the war against partisans, whole areas were cleansed and women nor children were spared. So how come the Germans were outraged by the Ustasha mass violence in Croatia? In this video, you're going to learn about the Wehrmacht perspective on mass violence in Croatia. Keep watching. Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, my name is Stefan. I'm a Dutch history teacher and I like to cover history for you. If you find it interesting, well, consider subscribing and also hit that notification bell. On April 9th, 1941, the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia started. On April 10th, the Germans entered Zagreb and Croatia seceded from Yugoslavia. The proclamation had been managed by the Germans. The new Croatian state extended over almost 40% of the former Yugoslav kingdom. It consisted roughly of modern-day Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Croatian Catholics amounted to around half of the 6.5 million people. It had 750,000 Muslims, 40,000 Jews, and 1.9 million Serbs. It was called the Independent State of Croatia, the NDH. Germany and Italy had divided their own spheres of influence. The Germans were heavily involved in the country's economy, and from day one there were German soldiers on the streets of Zagreb, and diplomatic representatives occupied important places. Therefore, the NDH can be hardly called independent. The state officially became a kingdom with the Italian Prince Aimone as Tomislav II on the throne. He never resided there. Ante Pavelić, who at the time of the Croatian independence declaration was still in Italy, became the leader of the NDH. A significant part of the population, generally in towns and particularly in Zagreb, viewed it favorably. The Ustašas had a modicum of popular support in Western Herzegovina and Lika, but virtually nowhere else. However, most people accepted the resurrection of the Croatian state with the feeling that the war had ended quickly and that the worst had been avoided. The worst was yet to come. Already on April 17th, the government passed a law on the protection of the people and the state, which made it possible for the Ustasha to kill anyone they wanted. Three groups were mainly targeted: Jews, Serbs, and Gypsies, Roma Sinti. The Ustasha became known for their murderous policies. Already from the first day after the Germans had taken over Zagreb, Jews were being arrested. The first mass killing occurred near the end of April. In the village of Gudovac, near the Croatian city of Bjelovar, where 200 Serbs were rounded up and executed by firing squad. The survivors were finished off with the bayonets. Now, this particular incident set in motion a whole wave of mass killings in the NDH. Confinement in camps started in July. The largest Croatian concentration camp was the Jasenovac complex, which was a death camp where Jews, Serbs, Gypsies, and undesirable Croats would meet their fate in horrifying ways. Then there were also concentration camps for children, such as Sisak and Jastre Barsko. Many Serbs and Jews, we're talking about men, women, and children, died at the hands of the Ustasha death squads that roamed the countryside. The Germans present weren't too keen on the chaotic terror, and one German general reported that the Ustasha has gone raving mad. Protests from German officials stationed in the NDH led Pavelić to outlaw the wild killings, but this was little more than cosmetic, since Hitler had encouraged him to pursue a nationally intolerant policy. What made the Wehrmacht so appalled by the Ustasha violence, since the Wehrmacht itself also committed mass violence in Yugoslavia? Countless of Serbs were massacred by the German army in Bosnia, then part of the NDH, but in other areas as well. The Germans had a disdain for the Serbs, so how come they disapproved the Ustasha violence? Well, for that we need to differentiate the violence of the Ustasha and the violence of the Wehrmacht. So in order to pinpoint the difference, we need to discuss its goals. The goal of the Ustasha was to purify their state of what they perceived as unwanted people, Serbs, Jews, and Roma Sinti. Muslims were not targeted by the NDH authorities. The Ustasha, Croatian revolutionary movement, originated in the interwar period. Its ideology was drawn from Croatian ultranationalism, Italian fascism, German Nazism, from authoritarianism and peasantism. So it was not a one-on-one copy of either fascism or Nazism. It had three basic components: racism, religion, and violence. Its leader, Ante Pavelić, once stated, "Knives, revolvers, automatic pistols, and time bombs are the bells that ring in the dawn and rebirth of the Croatian state." So let's take a look at the German side. What were their goals with Yugoslavia? Well, to be fair, Hitler's plans to invade Yugoslavia were drawn up fairly late. See, initially Hitler wanted Yugoslavia as an ally and used the country's railway network to invade Greece. The regent of Yugoslavia, Paul, signed the Tripartite Pact, but he was overthrown shortly after by Serbian military leaders, and Hitler then vowed to destroy Yugoslavia. So he did. Yet the South Slav state never was a prime target for the Nazis. They had their eyes on the USSR, which they want to cleanse of its inhabitants and colonize the lands. Yugoslavia, therefore, was more or less a side project, and the Germans were heavily involved in the country's economy after they overthrown the kingdom because they needed the resources for the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa started more or less 2 months after they conquered Yugoslavia. Especially in Croatia, the German army worked under conditions of scarcity in terms of manpower and material. What they wanted was order, but order was very much lacking in Axis-controlled Yugoslavia. From the get-go, there was resistance. The Yugoslav resistance manifested itself in two groups: the Chetniks and the partisans. The Chetniks were Serbian nationalists under the nominal command of Draza Mihailović. The partisans were communists under the command of Josip Broz Tito and were strongest in the NDH. Eventually, they clashed with one another, and Chetnik detachments collaborated with Axis forces. In name, they were led by Mihailović, who at some point believed the Axis brutal reprisals were not worth the resistance activities. In practice, many Chetnik units operated on their own. The partisans, on the other hand, were way more centralized. In order to combat the resistance, the Wehrmacht set up battle groups, Kampfgruppe, who had a space-centered approach. One of its commanders, General Alexander Löhr, believed it was the time to drop barriers restraining violence in warfare. From Löhr's perspective, the logic of modern warfare compelled rapid increase of violence against non-combatants. Technological changes, especially the introduction of the airplane, accelerated this process and set aside the concept of the non-combatant. Löhr endorsed the maximization of force, viewed war as a contest between whole societies as well as armies, and believed military violence could legitimately be directed against enemy societies. In other words, not only men of fighting age were targeted, but also the elderly, the women, and the children, all to achieve the goal of creating order out of chaos. However, chaos was also caused by the Ustashas, who had a people-centered approach and indiscriminately killed every person they did not deem worthy of life. The Ustasha did very little to hide their crimes. When the first mass killing occurred in the village of Gudovac, The Germans stationed nearby soon learned about this atrocity, and the German commander sent an investigation committee to investigate what happened. The German officers were clearly dismayed by the killings, and they even arrested 40 suspects. Why? A more likely explanation is that the act of investigation, just like the arrest of suspects, was a demonstration of German authority, a way of appeasing the local population, restoring order, and sending a message to the Ustasha that they could not operate with impunity. The arrested suspects were soon released, and on more occasions the Germans sent investigation committees to investigate the crimes of the Ustasha. German and also Italian soldiers who owned cameras took photographs. Some did so because they were shocked by the brutality of their co-belligerents, others as part of the more routine practice of creating a memento from a life being lived and detailing the realities and horrors of war in the Balkans. German General Edmund Gleser von Horstenau filed a report to Himmler. I am frequently told that German occupation troops would finally have to intervene against Ustasha crimes. This may happen eventually. Right now, with the available forces, I could not ask for such action. Ad hoc intervention in individual cases could make the German army look responsible for countless crimes which it could not prevent in the past. General Paul Bader proposed in the spring of 1942 to shoot at Ustasha troops who committed such atrocities, not out of consideration for the Serbs, but to restore order. As said before, the German High Command was keen on order. Interesting is to look at the words that the Germans used to describe their own violence. They used words as Vernichtung, elimination, Säuberung, cleansing, Durchkommen, coming through, or Befriedigung, pacification. Words like cleansed or elimination bestowed on German efforts a clinical and restrained appearance, an appearance undermined in fact by the wholesome brutality associated with these operations. However, when speaking of the crimes of the Ustasha, the Germans used words as Plünderungen, plunder, Übergriffe, excesses, Gräueltaten, atrocities, and Abschlachtung, butchery. The Wehrmacht believed they used violence out of necessity, and that the Ustasha used violence out of anger. The Wehrmacht acted brutally against the Serbs with their space-centered approach. And contrary to the Ustasha, who had a people-centered approach, killing people indiscriminately, the Germans confined their violence to specific areas. And try to grasp this. I am not advocating that the Wehrmacht in Yugoslavia was good. Comparing the Wehrmacht mass violence with the Ustasha mass violence in World War II Croatia, I think you compare the super terrible with the ultra terrible, if that makes sense. The Germans saw the two approaches as having conflicting objectives. Ustasha brutality was blamed for fueling the armed rebellion that the German army sought to quash. We've discussed what the German High Command thought of the Ustasha mass violence. I wasn't able to find sources about ordinary German soldiers and how they thought of the violence. I can imagine they weren't too keen on it either, for the same reason as the German High Command wasn't too keen on it, but also because the Ustasha brutality was way more extreme. See, there's killing and there is killing. The Germans mostly killed people with bombs or with rifles. The Ustasha killed their victims in way more sadistic ways, using knives, clubs, axes, saws, and hammers. Although not German, I did find an account of a Dutch volunteer in the Waffen-SS. He was in the Dutch Volunteer Legion, who wrote, "The merger with Germany was met with widespread opposition. Moreover, the presumptuous manner in which the Ustasha, roughly the Croatian SA, acted also made the government unpopular. The Croatian government was therefore chronically in trouble and lacked any prestige. Under these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that the bands of Tito and Mihailović were more feared than the governmental organs, which were otherwise very unreliable, like the national militia. This does resonate with the Wehrmacht views of the Croatian state. I did make an episode about the Dutch Volunteer Legion. See the pinned comment. If you have any more additional information, or perhaps are related to or have spoken to someone who witnessed what happened in Croatia during World War II, please share your insights in the comments below the video. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names right now. And a special thanks to Thomas Zabiega, Damian Wallace, Connor, Philip Jordan, Marcus Kaas, Nick Terranova, Haley, Mark Littlehill, Janusz Dozinkiewicz, Joanne, Justin Tabell, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, Andrea Marti, Susanna Di Bella, John Beach, Fabrizio, Wayback History, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Luis Pichera, and Mike West. If you want to learn more about the German perspective on World War II, I have a playlist for you right here, and I also made a video about Croatia during the Second World War. You can click right here, and I thank you for watching. Leave a like, leave a comment, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you later.